Everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, a conversation with Secretary of State Shenna Bellows. 2020 was a banner year for democracy across the United States, and Maine was no exception. Nationwide, nearly 2/3 of eligible voters turned out for the presidential election, and here in Maine, turnout was more than 76%. Many of us voted by mail, put our ballots in secure drop boxes, and volunteered at the polls. Maine's new Secretary of State, Shenna Bellows, is here to celebrate those wins and to discuss her priorities, the state of voting rights in Maine, and what improvements we can expect to see over the next decade in our elections. Welcome, Shenna. Next slide. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 8,500 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA works through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. Next slide. A few technical notes. You are all muted, but we definitely want to hear from you. You can send questions directly to me, Kathleen, through the chat as they occur to you. You can find that chat by hovering your mouse over the bottom of your screen, and I'll keep track of your questions to ask during the Q&A session at the end. If you have any technical difficulties, you can message Will Sedlak through the chat and he'll help you out. This event is being recorded, and we will post the video on our website later this afternoon, where you can also find recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. Thank you again for joining us. And Shenna, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, and thank you to Maine Conservation Voters for hosting this awesome Lunch and Learn series. It's really exciting to be with all of you today, a real honor and privilege. I'm going to speak a little bit about how I came to this work, the state of voting rights in Maine, and looking to the future, our priorities, which I know are shared goals with Maine Conservation Voters. So I grew up in Hancock, Maine. We were poor. I grew up without electricity or running water until I was in the 5th grade. And I worked my way through high school, and actually I just spoke to Ellsworth High School this morning to students there, and college. But I felt really supported and fortunate to have wonderful parents, strong teachers, and people who helped me along the way. So following my education at Middlebury College, where I graduated with a degree in international politics and economics, like so many young people today, my first goal was paying off student debt. And I found myself in the corporate world, working for an economics consulting firm in Washington, D.C., paying off my student loans, but really unhappy, not following my passions. So I applied for and went into the Peace Corps. I was assigned to Panama as a small business volunteer, and it was an extraordinary experience. As a young person in high school, I had studied abroad in Brazil. In college, I'd studied abroad in Costa Rica. So it brought some of those cross-cultural competencies to bear, but working and living in that environment in the Peace Corps was just the toughest job I've ever loved, as they say. And Peace Corps had loan forgiveness. I went from the Peace Corps to AmeriCorps Vista. I was assigned to work in Nashville, Tennessee, with young people, high school students, in Nashville's largest public housing project. So I was working primarily with young African-American students on educational and economic empowerment. So linking them to opportunities in the business community for paid internships and college scholarships and college preparation. And then it was 2002 and the economy was a mess. And so I went home to live with my parents in Hancock. And my dad said, you should volunteer for this amazing candidate, Shelley Pingree. She's running for US Senate against Susan Collins. So I started volunteering for Shelley. And that was really my entry into politics. I was hired by the Maine Democratic Party to be a Hancock County field organizer that fall. And Shelley didn't win, but I learned so much and thereby started a passion for engagement in the political process. I told the students at Ellsworth High School this morning that I sent out 100+ resumes after that campaign experience and didn't hear back from any of them. Just 3 organizations contacted me in response to those resumes. But one of those organizations was the ACLU. And I went to work for the ACLU in Washington, D.C. as an organizer in 2003 and had the great fortune there to work on a variety of national issues, including the Voting Rights Act reauthorization. We were preparing for that at the time. I also like to tell the story of the importance of parents in your life and home. My dad always used to say, "When are you coming home, Shen?" You know, right after college. "You want to move back to Maine?" Right after the Peace Corps. And so a job, and I would always say, "When there's a job, I will come home when there is work that I can do in Maine." And so he calls me up one day and he said, "So the executive director position of the ACLU of Maine is open. You should apply. You could move home to Maine." And I said, "Dad, I'm 29 years old. I'm not a lawyer. I have no experience." "You do. That's crazy talk." He had worked on the House and become good friends with a man in Hancock who had served on the board of directors. This is where Maine, being like one large small town, is sometimes really sweet. And so he introduced me to this former board member who talked to me about why he thought I should apply. So I applied. And I like to tell young people, you shouldn't put limits on yourself, right? And I think for all of us at any point in our lives, we need to stop saying no to ourselves and start saying yes to the possibilities in our dreams. Working as executive director of the ACLU of Maine was extraordinary. Partnering with Maine conservation voters, for example, on restoring same-day voter registration when a Republican-controlled legislature eliminated it in 2010. Working together to advance voting rights and to fight back against voter suppression. Remember the bills that would have stripped college students of the right to vote, or people who were incarcerated of the right to vote, or voter ID? Together, this group, many of you in this virtual room, and our partners were able to defeat those bills. Fast forward to 2014, I had been a leader in the marriage equality campaign and in a variety of other civil rights issues. And so I challenged Susan Collins, following Shelley Pingree's footsteps, right? Challenged Susan Collins. That was such a learning experience. And one of the things I like to talk about is losing forward. So sticking to principles, engaging with grassroots, our walk across Maine, when I walked from Holton to Kittery, getting to talk to people in small towns along the way, touring farms and businesses and really talking about issues that matter. So even though it was hard to lose in that moment, that really prepared me for where I am now. So when that 2016 state Senate seat opened up, I was ready to run and to win. And thank you to Maine conservation voters for helping me with that. So I was just recently elected and sworn in as the first female Secretary of State for Maine, our 50th Secretary of State. My grandmother is 101 years old this year. She was born in 1920. That was the year that women gained the right to vote. And so what it means to me to be in this role, it's really humbling to think about the women and supportive men on whose shoulders I stand, and to think about how far we've come, but to also think about how far we have left to go. So first, I want to just share a little bit about the scope of the office of Secretary of State, and then talk about what my vision and priorities are before we engage in a conversation about the state of our democracy and voting rights in Maine and nationally right now. So the original sort of mission of the Secretary of State, you can see a gold circle on the wall behind me. That's the seal of Maine, placed there actually installed by Secretary of State Charlie Summers. And the constitutional obligation of the Secretary of State is to be the guardian of the seal and the keeper of the records. So I oversee Maine State Archives, the original Maine Constitution, and those are copies of the Maine Constitution on that other wall behind me. I got to confess, when I was that kid growing up without electricity or running water, I sent away in a magazine for posters of the Bill of Rights and the preamble to the Constitution, which were on my bedroom wall. So it is such a thrill to walk into an office to have these documents on my office wall, actually also placed there by Secretary Summers at the time. It's just, I'm in awe every day walking in past those documents. But that's the foremost responsibility. I head the Maine State Archives. Yesterday, we launched a digital catalog called Archive Space to share with the public what is in our collections. And we are in the process, staff have been working diligently to start to scan a lot of those records. So when I was preparing my swearing in speech, I went online to see what had been scanned, and I saw, ooh, Hancock County, my home county, Revolutionary War records. And on my mother's side, we have a distant ancestor with the unique name Hate Evil Colson, which you don't forget. And sure enough, there was Hate Evil Colson's Revolutionary War pension digitized and placed online. So what we hold in archives, the historical records of the state of Maine, is something that I just feel a unique privilege to house. And one of our first meetings as secretary was with Maine's Wabanaki tribes to talk about, okay, how do we digitize and share the records that impact Maine's tribes and make sure that they have access and that we are in some ways decolonizing our archives? How do we lift up the hidden histories or darker histories in Maine? And earlier this year, I was proud to appoint and then swear in after Senate confirmation Maine's first female state archivist, Kate McBrien, who is an expert on Malaga Island, the island where Maine, unfortunately, tragically, evicted and confined. It was a multiracial community that the state of Maine destroyed. So archives to me is a very important privilege and an exciting part of the role. The second aspect of the work is the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. Now, when I was taking driver ed at Ellsworth High School, driving a beat up 1970s Chevy Nova, I never dreamed that my name would be on the driver license. The Bureau of Motor Vehicles oversees licenses and identifications. It oversees vehicle registrations, titles, and every aspect of commercial motor vehicles that you can imagine as well. Commercial trucking, for example, enforcement, car dealer licensing. And at the ACLU, I did a lot of work with the Maine Immigrants' Rights Coalition and Immigrant Legal Advocacy Project on making sure that we had access to licenses for our immigrant and refugee communities. So that too is a passion of mine. Most of the employees at the Secretary of State's office work at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. We have over 300 employees in that bureau doing that work. And then the third aspect of the Secretary of State is the Bureau of Corporations, Elections, and Commissions. So the Secretary of State oversees all of the corporate filings of the more than 100 corporations in the state of Maine, the annual filings, that's the corporation side. We oversee the official records in terms of the composition of the boards and commissions and the appointments of the boards and commissions for the state. And then the main conversation today, we oversee elections. Now, you might be astonished to know that right now there are only 8 people who work under the direction of our Deputy Secretary of State for Corporations, Elections, and Commissions who work on elections. It is an incredible staff. Maine has municipal-based elections, as we all know. So we oversee the more than 500 municipalities in the administration of all of Maine's elections. So I want to talk big picture about the priorities of what brought me to run. I ran for office because I'm passionate about our constitutional rights, because voting rights are fundamental to everything else we care about, from the environment to civil rights to education and healthcare. But I had 2 big goals. One of those is technology modernization. How do we leverage technology to improve how government serves the people and to improve that relationship between the people, to really fully realize this ideal of a government for and by the people? And whether it's at the BMV with online rapid renewal of your license or registration, or online voter registration, which is something I'm working with Maine Conservation Voters to try to achieve in the future. Technology modernization can be a powerful thing. And I think the pandemic has revealed the challenges of the fact that Maine is somewhat behind in this area, and also the opportunities that allow us to be together in this room weekly, if you want. And the second big goal is equity and inclusion. How are we ensuring that what we do is inclusive of all people? That how are we disrupting white supremacy? How are we breaking down the barriers that bar participation in government, in civic life, in voting? And so when we talk about, those are my two big picture priorities for the agency, and we're already underway. I appointed Maine's first Latina Deputy Secretary of State, Joan Bautista, to assist me in policymaking and advancing equity and inclusion efforts. I appointed at the BMV a new Deputy Secretary for Branch Operations, Equity and Inclusion. And on the technology side, I brought in someone to the BMV who has experience at the national level, and we're hiring a new Chief Information Officer to really move those modernization efforts forward. So let's talk about voting rights. So I just want to thank Maine Conservation Voters for being a huge leader and just doing so much in 2020 to advance and defend the integrity of our elections and the right to participate for all Maine citizens. There are a variety of legislative initiatives that are moving forward this year. The legislature has a lot of excitement around expanding access to voting rights. I was a founding member of the Committee for Ranked Choice Voting. I'm passionate about ranked choice voting. I'm passionate about increasing voter registration. And one of the questions was, what's the state of voting rights in Maine? Well, the news is good in that Maine has consistently one of the highest rates of voter participation in the country. We ranked third this year after Minnesota and Colorado. Just over 75% of eligible Mainers participated in our election. 62% of Mainers voted absentee, either by mail or in-person absentee. And our 30-day window for in-person absentee voting or absentee voting is one of the most generous in the country. So we do, in many ways, make it easy for people to participate, to vote. One of the fun things that Joanne and I have been doing is testifying before the Oregon legislature, before both Senate and House committees, about voting rights for all citizens, including people who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated, which is a reform that Oregon is pursuing with our support. It was fun to talk to the news in Alaska, and today I'm talking to Minnesota about secretaries of state about ranked choice voting and how to advance that. But here in our state, we still have a lot of work to do. So we do well, but we could do better. Imagine if we had 80% voter participation, or my goal, 90% voter participation. How would we do that? Automatic voter registration is legislation that passed, sponsored by Speaker Gideon last session. I was proud to be an original sponsor the prior session and a co-sponsor last year. That's something that a lot of states are doing, where you go to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles and you don't just fill out the card, you type into a keypad your information, and it syncs with the information we already have to automatically register you to vote. And it becomes an opting out, where everyone who's seeking a license renewal gets asked, are you registered to vote? No? Would you like to? That's our goal. And so this is something that as Secretary of State, it's my responsibility to implement. And I'm working with our IT team and our Bureau, the motor vehicles branches and the elections team to figure out how we do that and do that effectively, because I think that will increase voter participation, especially among vulnerable and marginalized communities. Because to participate in society, you do need a license or an ID. You do, well, you can do a lot of this online, but you do often need to go to a branch. So that is a point of contact where we can bring in new groups of people for voter registration. The second piece of expanding participation is that something I've touched on with technology modernization, but the goal isn't just because of technology. The goal is to increase access, and that is online voter registration. Because those students at Ellsworth High School, why can't they register to vote via their phone? They can do so much else in daily life. They are so used to working via phone or the internet. And so I think online voter registration is crucial. And the good news is most states around the country are already going there and developing that. We can learn from people who have done this before us. A third priority is Speaker Ryan Fecteau's bill. So one of the limitations sometimes is the processing around absentee voting. I have to confess, I would love to see, not just confess, I testified earlier this week, but I would love to see early voting and a Colorado model potentially where we're mailing ballots to folks and people have an option. They can vote by mail or they can go to the polls. And that we're doing away with the processing and costs associated with an application for an absentee ballot. Even though in Maine, we have one of the reforms that's being pursued nationally, we have no excuse absentee voting until the third business day before the election. But Speaker Fecteau's bill is a first step, right? Because our Constitution has been interpreted to say that Maine cannot do early voting because voting is established as being on election day, the first Tuesday in November. And so Speaker Fecteau's bill for ongoing absentee voting would allow you to apply for permanent status, ongoing status. So you could fill out an application and say, I want to vote by mail moving forward. And that's our hope. We're seeking bipartisan support. Maine Conservation Voters has been a great partner in this, and I'm hopeful that we will see that move forward. Another bill that is a priority for me personally is post-election audits. It's an important role of the Secretary of State to maintain public confidence in our elections and to secure the integrity of our elections. Even in a state like Maine where we do so well, it's important to have a review process, an audit process, I think, to increase voter confidence in future integrity of our elections, but also to see what we might do different or what we might improve. And then finally, something that we're working on, and again, this is administrative rather than legislative, although there's some legislative alternatives, is thinking through the accuracy of our voter registration lists and how we do voter list maintenance that is not exclusive and does not eliminate valid voters, but does ensure that we have accurate information in terms of who is registered and who is an eligible voter. Last but not least, I think the real conversation in many ways, I think there's so much we can do to improve what we're doing in Maine, both administratively and legislatively. But nationally, we're seeing across the country, I'm sure you're seeing it on the news, hundreds of voter suppression bills being introduced right next door in New Hampshire, in Georgia, all across the country. We are seeing a variety of measures specifically designed to exclude Black, Indigenous, and people of color, young people, infrequent voters, poor people from voting. And so it is time for HR 1, the For the People Act. It is time for comprehensive democracy reform, a federal floor that tells the states, no, you cannot go down that road. There are basic standards that you need to meet. We also need to pass HR 4 to expand and renew the Voting Rights Act. But HR 1 is particularly important. And it was an extraordinary privilege for me. One of the things I didn't realize about the job is that as soon as I was elected, secretaries of state from across the country started reaching out to me there's a wonderfully strong bipartisan network of the National Association of Secretaries of State. And with some of the secretaries, I'm texting daily about different issues. So there's this great built-in professional collegial network of support. And so at the National Association of Secretaries of State conference, we had an opportunity to talk with members of Congress about HR 1. And I shared my excitement because HR 1 takes a lot of what we do well in Maine and brings it to the federal level. So same-day voter registration would be mandated under HR 1. Voting rights for people who are formerly incarcerated will be mandated under HR 1. HR 1 includes campaign finance provisions, which are not part of the purview of the Secretary of State, but in many ways parallel or modeled very similar to what we do with Maine Clean Elections. And so to me and to Representative Golden and Representative Pingree, that's very exciting as well. And so in sharing that excitement, a member of Congress, Representative Zoe Lofgren, who chaired the committee in the House, reached out to me and said, would you be willing to testify before Congress about Maine's experience with these measures and the impact that it has made in your state? I didn't get to go to Washington because of the pandemic, but I got to testify from right here in this room. And you can see behind me a portrait of Frederick Douglass. It's a Robert Shetterly portrait, part of his series, Americans Who Tell the Truth. He's a Blue Hill artist. I'm also surrounded by the late Congressman John Lewis, Sojourner Truth, and Francis Perkins. And I have to say, it was wonderful to share Maine's voting experience. It was also pretty fabulous when Congressman Butterfield said, Secretary Bellows, I really like the Frederick Douglass portrait behind you. So I'm going to stop here. I would love to engage with your questions and have a conversation, and just want to reiterate the power of engagement, the power of making a difference, because I think we're seeing it at the federal level. I think we see it with the House vote. Thank you for outreach you've already done. And I think certainly in the legislature, it's made an extraordinary difference in strengthening what we have today. So with that, thank you.
Thank you so much, Shenna. My goodness, your story is so powerful, and you tell it so beautifully. And as you transition from your story to the major responsibilities as Secretary of State, I just kept thinking you were made for this job. I am in awe, and I'm so proud to have you as our Secretary of State. So thank you. I saw lots and lots of nodding heads when you started talking about HR 1. So I have a feeling this won't surprise anybody on the call, that we would love for the call to action from today's Lunch and Learn to be, let's let our senators know. We want HR 1. We want to restore the Voting Rights Act and modernize our elections and end partisan gerrymandering and all of those things. Later this afternoon, we will send out a follow-up email with a link that makes it super easy for you to send a message to Senator King and Senator Collins and let them know how much we want them to vote yes on HR 1. All right, let's ask some questions. Starting at the top of your presentation, you talked about decolonizing the Maine State Archives, and that really resonated because, you know, we've talked a lot in some of these Lunch and Learn programs about Maine's history and the parts of our history that we are not good at acknowledging or understanding or grappling with. What's the best way to access those archives online, and what do you recommend for somebody who wants to learn more, but maybe doesn't know what to, doesn't have an ancestor with a distinctive name to start the search with?
I'm going to paste in the chat a link to Archive Space, which we launched yesterday. Definitely, if you're on social media, please follow us at Maine SOS and Maine State Archives, because you can sort of stay up to date with some of those things. And I encourage you to just sort of poke around and explore. Because, and I think one of the challenges for us, so actually last summer, Maine State Archives had been in the cultural building adjoining the legislature or next to the legislature. Many of you may know it.
Where the museum is.
Where the museum and the library were. The building has a huge asbestos problem. And in the summer, the HVAC system failed entirely. And there were also some mold issues. So the building had to be evacuated. We have had to remove 56,000 boxes of records from the cultural building. We're actually not done yet. So the Maine State Archive staff is 15 people. Obviously, the state has professional movers that we work with as well. But it's been a really arduous process. But it did create an opportunity. And I think in every challenge, there's an opportunity, right? And I really admire the archive staff. And actually, Kate McGryan, she was recruited by Matt Dunlap. So he gets some credit for finding Maine's first female archivist. And her confirmation didn't go through because of the pandemic, but she was in a temporary status. So she and the team realized this is our chance to start to really catalog in a better way than we've ever done before what we have. They had to track it for the move. Let's translate that to the online space. So we have a team of people who are, their job is just to scan every day, contract scanners. But the team did work on this archive space website, which is kind of like a digital card catalog for folks that remember card catalogs. That's what this archive space is. So sometimes it will point you to digital documents, and sometimes it will say, you're going to need to contact an archivist. But our goal, what we're seeking to do, is to continually be digitizing things that people need and to start to make those connections with the public. Because what used to happen is you had to go to archives and ask for something that you thought might exist. And we still offer that services. Researchers, we get a lot of genealogy researchers or Civil War. Maine has some excellent Civil War collections. Folks will come to archives and ask an archivist to go and find those documents and bring it to the reviewing room, as it were. But this is where technology can allow us to do that surfing from our living room, right? And in terms of decolonization, one of the things that I think is really important is to follow the lead of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in thinking about how we disrupt white supremacy, right? So I think those meetings with the tribal historic preservation officers to talk to them about what we can do to support them and follow their lead in understanding how we can improve accessibility is really important. And to your point, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that former Secretary Matt Dunlap was part of identified Maine's child separation policies, the policies of separating children from tribal families and placing them in white families, a policy that continued into the early 2000s as genocide. And I think we do have to confront that hard history. I've talked a lot about what's on my walls. There's one more painting on my walls, and that's around Malaga Island. Daniel Minter does a series called Malaga Girl. And I think it's really important that we prioritize documents that tell some of these stories. I keep Malaga Girl on my wall to remind me that it's important not to idealize all of our past and our history. As powerful as the Constitution and Bill of Rights are, embedded in the original US Constitution is our original sin as a country, right? So we have some work to do in that area.
And it sounds like you're really working with Black, Indigenous, and people of color to help shape that. Are you involved in the tribal sovereignty efforts in the legislature this session?
I was as a state senator.
Okay.
I haven't been as Secretary of State. I am really proud of testifying in support of LD2 and racial impact statements and sharing with the legislature the importance of bringing that analysis to every policy that we do as a state agency. But we're still sort of working through where we weigh in and where we don't, where we depart from prior secretaries of state, where we stay aligned. So Yeah. But that's
And I know,
just as given my former hat, incredibly important. We need to support the tribes and amend the Indian Land Claims Resettlement Act and really finally recognize the sovereignty of Maine's tribes.
thank you for your advocacy. And just a note that LD2 was passed by the legislature yesterday. So thank you for your advocacy and helping to make that happen.
Absolutely.
We had a question. You mentioned the just awful history of adoption. Doesn't even feel like the right word when kids are forcibly taken from their families. But are those adoption records closed, or are they able to track people down? Do you know?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. And I will find out. And if there's a way to communicate it back to the group, I will. Or alternatively, we can try to communicate it in some of our communications. I honestly don't know. And that is one of the things that I've noticed as Secretary of State is, and just as a public official, one of the things in our culture, it's sort of embarrassing sometimes to say, I don't know, but we have to get better at recognizing areas that we're not familiar with or areas where we need to do more education. So yes, so I don't know, but I can try to find out and get back to you.
I love that. Thank you. A couple of questions about some of the election innovations or possible election innovations in the news. So a lot of folks have heard conversations about open primaries or semi-open primaries. What do you think about that? What does that mean? What should we expect?
So I think, this is an interesting area where I am undergoing an education. So as a senator, as a Democratic senator, I voted against open primaries. My perspective being, if you wanted to participate in a Democratic primary, you should register as a Democrat. And if you wanted to participate as a Republican, you should register as a Republican. But I had a really great conversation with an advocate that started to change my views on this. And the conversation was about young people. And when you're first registering to vote, and that ability to change your mind. Or like, I remember when I was 18, I was unenrolled because I didn't know. I mean, my parents were Democrats, but I was independent minded. And it took me a few years. It was after college, I think, I don't remember, when I changed my registration to Democrat. And similarly, my nephew, he's going to kill me, but he registered in the Democratic primary and the presidential. But he told me this winter that he thinks he's more of a Republican. And, he's 18, and that's an important time of exploration. So this advocate was talking to me about open primaries and the ability for a voter to cast a vote in the primary of their choice in a particular cycle as a really effective way to encourage and engage younger voters in the process. And that is definitely something that I've been thinking a lot about and makes a great deal of sense to me. I think there's some logistical challenges, but other states are doing it. And so I think with logistical challenges, and as an elections administrator, it is my job to educate the legislature about what the logistical challenges might be. I shared the size of our staff, which is small, and our technology is, quite frankly, antiquated. We need to do some modernization of our central voter registration in our systems. But I don't think logistical challenges is a reason not to do something. I think it's about making sure we have resources and a plan. So I'm very intrigued by the idea as a mechanism for increasing voter participation.
That's fascinating. And I really appreciate you sharing the sort of evolution in your thinking, because just like we need to do a better job of getting comfortable saying, I don't know, we need to do a better job of getting comfortable changing our minds. So thank you. You talked about reaching young voters, and there has been conversation about actually lowering the voting age. what do you think about that, of making, say, 16-year-olds eligible to vote?
So again, this has initiated some really fun and interesting conversations in the Secretary of State's office. I personally think there are huge benefits to engaging young people when they're in high school. If they register to vote right in high school or at that, at the first opportunity at age 18, they're likely to then develop that lifelong habit of voting, right? So there's an extraordinary opportunity there. I have been engaged in conversations with clerks who are very opposed, with some of the folks on the team, and just talking through what would it look like, what would it mean, how would it integrate with our rules, in terms of the U.S. Constitution, the voting age of 18 for federal elections, because of course this would be for municipal-based elections. So I can't yet tell you what the position of the Department of Secretary of State will be. But what I can tell you is I think we need to be thinking about this, right? Because our democracy is in crisis. I see somebody talked about January 6th in the chat. That was an insurrection. That was an assault on the Capitol. And that doesn't happen when democracy is healthy. Similarly, our climate is in crisis. And thank you all for the work that you're doing to move that forward. But we need young people to be part of the solution, because we're unfortunately leaving with some things that are better off than when we started, but then there are lots of other things where we're leaving things a little worse off. Anyway, so I think anything that we can do to sort of start to connect and think through what are structures of increased voter participation for young people are really valuable. And also public education. That's why I was so excited to speak to my high school this morning. I spoke to Marana Cook High School, which is, serves my hometown of Manchester, earlier this week. And I spoke to Bates College, and I'm speaking to some Girl Scouts this afternoon. So if any of you advise any Girl Scout troops or connected to any high schools or colleges, I'm happy to go and talk to those young people and talk to them about how to get involved and engaged.
I have a feeling you're going to get a lot of invitations because I can't think of a better connection to make than to get you in front of a Zoom full of young people and inspiring them. You mentioned with the voting age that that could create this sort of conflict in Maine election law and federal election law, which reminds me of ranked choice voting. Can you just give us an update? Where are we on ranked choice voting? When are we allowed to use it? When are we not allowed to use it? Is there any hope of just making it across the board? Let's make this simple.
So yes, we were just talking about Representative Seth Berry's bill, which will be coming up for a public hearing soon. He would apply ranked choice voting to municipal races. So right now, ranked choice voting applies to our state races in the primary, but not the general, and to our federal races. I think that people saw the power of ranked choice voting in the Golden Poliquin race. I think that was a success story, and saw the success with the administration of ranked choice voting at the state level. And so clearly it's a method that's been upheld by referendum by the people of Maine twice. So I think that is extraordinarily significant. But so there was a constitutional amendment conversation earlier this session. The challenge is we need to get to 2/3 support. In order to amend the Constitution, we need 2/3 of the legislature to agree. And then that needs to, I think the voters would be all for it, but we're not there yet. And so anything anybody in this room, this virtual room, can do to start to build to that 2/3 majority. And I think some of it is demystifying the process. And fortunately, I think the voters get it, right? And I think this is why they voted for it twice. It makes sense to people that in life, you have choices, you like I like cookie dough ice cream better than chocolate and chocolate better than vanilla. You know, it's not hard. But yeah, I think we have some work to do to get the legislature, the people that represent us, to be truly representing their population on this, and to try to make it nonpartisan. And that's not necessarily on the Democrats, like, but we shouldn't do bipartisanship for the sake of bipartisanship. We should look for shared values.
You mentioned our work ahead in reminding the folks who represent us what we think, which feels like a great opportunity to say what we love to tell people, which is if state lawmakers hear from 3 or 4 people, that's a lot. We say that all the time, Secretary Bellows. Is it true, you as a state senator, if you heard from 3 or 4 people, did it sway you?
It sure did. And, you know, I remember in my first race for state senate, and of course, I was running to replace a Republican incumbent who'd retired. And I was running in a district, actually, my first race was in 2016, and Trump won that district, and I won too. But I remember 2 meetings that I have very fond memories about. 2 women reached out to me and said, we want to meet with you. And so I met with them at my kitchen table. And they said, we want to talk about Maine clean elections. And we really want to talk about Maine clean elections. We don't want you to just tell us that you support it. We want to talk about these changes that the League of Women Voters are pursuing, and Maine Citizens for Clean Elections are pursuing, and some of the fights that you're going to be in, you know, some of the votes that you're going to have to take and what you might do. Those 2 women became resources for me, along with the League of Women Voters and Maine Citizens for Clean Elections. But you better believe, because I'd had that conversation in my campaign, because I'd made those commitments. Now, granted, I was inclined to do that anyway, but they helped take me to the next level, right? They helped keep me accountable on all of the votes. And then a second conversation, which was really an example of me not knowing very much about an issue, was a group of environmentalists who invited me to a meeting in their home. And there were, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 people in the room. And it was about arsenic and well water, something I knew nothing about. Now, of course, instinctually, everyone's against arsenic and well water, but I didn't know how much of a problem it was in Kennebec County, and how important and what could be done about it. Because that's the other thing. So often in the legislature, there are these message votes, right? You vote against arsenic and well water, but then it sits on the appropriations table and the fix never gets funded. This happened, I used to be executive director of the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine, extraordinary organization. And there was a bill to mandate Holocaust and human rights education. Everybody was like, yep, great idea. And then it languished on the appropriations table. But that meeting with those activists educated me about the issue, made me a champion, and gave me the tools to work with people in the legislature to get something passed and get something funded. And they didn't do it just with me, they did it with Republicans. So that was a bipartisan initiative. So I really do think that, now granted, we can't have those face-to-face meetings right now, but you could certainly do a Zoom coffee with someone. And the other thing that I will say is Maine legislators are so accessible. So there were some people that would call me or text me or email me regularly. And to your point, Kathleen, it is 100% accurate. If you get 1 email, you're like, huh. If you get 4 emails, you're like, okay, wow, this is a big deal. If you get 10 emails, especially if they're unique, right? Like obviously there's the robo email, right? Like clicktivism. And clicktivism is not ineffective. I actually had to go brief the caucus on the dangers of a Article 5 convention, because there's a AstroTurf group that gets people to click emails saying, please pass an Article 5 constitutional amendment, resolution for an Article 5 constitutional convention. And what would that do? That would open up the whole Constitution. And what would that mean? Well, it might mean problems given the current composition of the Congress for, I don't know, 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, or reproductive justice, or other things that we really care about. That's a sidebar, but my point is legislators were getting so many emails about that, even though they were generic, that it was starting to create some question for them and some concern. So it's a big deal. Even if you just click the button, that matters. But if you take the time to write a personalized note, that really matters.
Thank you. There's another potential constitutional amendment being discussed that sounds pretty similar to the Equal Rights Amendment. Are you involved in that at all?
So I'm 100% in support of the Equal Rights Amendment. I think it is astonishing that equal rights for women is not in the US Constitution. As a state senator, I was really proud to chair the Labor Committee and to work on issues like equal pay for equal work that was sponsored by Senator Kathy Breen. Really important legislation because I'd experienced pay discrimination twice in the career that I just described. I uncovered 2 examples of where I was being paid less than men who were hired on the same day for the same job. So anyway, that's a sidebar. So yes, I believe in the Equal Rights Amendment because we're not talking about discrimination that happened to my grandmother or even my mother. This is discrimination that was fairly recent and is still pervasive when you look at the data and the statistical data. And it's worse for women of color and Indigenous women and Black women. And that's something we really need to recognize as well.
Do you have I know as a person, I imagine you are quite active and supportive of helping women in abusive relationships. Is there a role for the Secretary of State's office on that or around one of our participants said, oh,
we
great.
manage the address confidentiality program out of our office, out of our central office. It's not an entire bureau or department. It's actually a team of, well, it's one person that manages the program and then is supported by the 2 administrative support staff in the office. But what that means is a person who's experienced violence can apply to the address confidentiality program. And that means that their mail is sent to us so that their address can be hidden from public view and so that they can't be tracked by their abuser. So it's a really important program. Maine's program is under-resourced compared to most states, but our team takes it really seriously and really works hard on that. And we have some really strong and important relationships with the agencies that advocate for people who experience abuse and violence.
Thank you. I didn't even know about that program. So thank you for sharing that. And also thanks for correcting me. I transitioned from the Equal Rights Amendment and women's issues to domestic abuse, but you are absolutely right. It is not limited to one category of people. So thank you.
Absolutely. Can I go back to the Equal Rights Amendment for a minute?
Yeah.
There's something else our office does. We house the Permanent Commission on the Status of Women. And talk about under-resourced. This is a group of volunteers who do an extraordinary report on a regular basis for the legislature and try to do public education and think about systemic sexism and opportunities for women and girls. Great group and no funding. So we support them and we're trying to think with them creatively about how we can lift up the work that they're doing and help to professionalize some of that work.
I'm so grateful that you are in this role because, wow, this is really exciting. Let's bring it back around to elections for our last question. How do we plan long-term for secure and modern elections?
So this is hard to say in this moment, but it's really important that we invest. So I've been transparent with the legislature. Our election staff performed 2,933 hours of overtime in 2020. If you divide that by 52 weeks in a year and 40 hours a week, that is 73 weeks of overtime. That is not sustainable. Thank God we have amazing leaders like Deputy Secretary of State Julie Flynn, who's been doing this for 27 years in Maine, who herself worked over 9 weeks worth of overtime. Thank goodness that we have this committed, dedicated team who gave up weekends and holidays and evenings and time from their family. And some of them under the civil service aren't eligible for that overtime, like Julie. So it's like, great, you get 9 weeks of vacation. Oh, you can't take it. So that is a function of under-resourcing the agency, right? That's, 73 weeks is probably, it's 1.4 full-time equivalents, 2 people, and that would solve that problem. And we need to do more long-term thinking about future needs. So what would it take to do really effective post-election audits? Well, not someone who's exhausted from overtime. We need an audit staff, right? What will it take to do really, and let's talk about technology. Our central voter registration system was installed in 2007. It's 14 years old. So there's a lot of capability. There's a lot of transparency and security measures with new systems. We should be taking advantage of those. So we need to be making consistent and increased investments in elections infrastructure, because we have been extraordinarily fortunate that due to the dedication and expertise of our teams, they've made things work. But we need to be planning for the future. We need to be planning for what's next. And, I come to this work with an excitement for all of these reforms. We need to make sure that we are resourcing those reforms. So I know we're in a difficult economic climate. I know that it's hard to think about expanding any aspect of state government, but our elections are the foundation for everything else. And without healthy elections, without public trust in our elections, without integrity and confidence in the accuracy and security of the results, everything else falls down.
I'm convinced. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I am so grateful, but I have to tell you, I am not the only one who is grateful and excited about your new job as Secretary of State. We are going to put this in the mail to you, but we couldn't resist sharing this thank you and congratulations card signed by a whole bunch of our members who are just thrilled that Maine has our first female Secretary of State, and even better, it's you. Thank you, Shenna. It's been just an incredibly interesting and inspiring hour. Thanks to all of you who joined us. Next week, we'll get back into the legislative agenda of Maine's Environmental Priorities Coalition. We kicked that agenda off back in January, and we've been doing some deep dives to find out more about each of our priority bills. I hope you can join us next week to hear about LD 125, an act to prohibit the aerial spraying of glyphosate. That's the fancy word for Roundup, and other synthetic herbicides in Maine's woods. That bill has been sponsored by Senate President Troy Jackson, and he will join us next week, along with Heather Spalding from MOFGA and some folks who live in the North Woods, to help us explore why this is such a harmful practice and what we can do to shift towards more ecologically friendly forestry practices. Till then, thank you all. Get out there, have a wonderful weekend. And again, Shenna, thanks a million.
Thank you, everyone.